Divine Invention, Book 1 in the Hero's Arc, by Lyndon Forster. To everyone who has been with this story from the beginning. The golden sun rains upon the ingenuous and casts them into possibility. Prologue. Through the deep dark mists of space, time rolls on. There is little to distract from the endless ticking metronome. Time conducts the universe, only coaxed into crescendos by impatient wormholes. Space, on the grand scheme, is monotonous. Yes, it does contain all the universe and all of everything, but it also has all of nothing. Species that call the cosmos home must be extremely large and live for an exceedingly long time and think excruciatingly slowly just to stop themselves going mad. A planet's century to them could pass in the blink of an eye. Star giants are the epitome of these space beings. These mighty creatures stroll the cosmos, never staying in one place, never revisiting a solar system, because the universe is still big even to something that considers a sunbed literally a bed of suns. These space hooligans swat asteroids, boot planets, and use stars to toast their marshmallows. In space, nothing blows and nothing falls. Things simply drift. Following explosions in the beginning times, everything in the universe was granted energy. Energy may never die. It fades and it transfers and it warps. Each half-life drains it, but there is always a plug. Rocks of every shape and size pass through the blackness. Cold grips them and breathes life into crystals. Snowflakes grow 1,000 miles wide. They pass planets and solar systems and galaxies, but nothing with an abstract concept of beauty ever lays eyes on these monolithic tesseracts, so they cannot rightly be described to be. However, there are those who find them, and do see them, and the snowflakes bring joy and venture. Being the young zesty star giants that they were, Ukta and Kraktor decided to make the most of the snow flecking their cheeks. The records are lacking on who threw the first snowball, but it probably missed, as did all the early frigid flingings, what with space being rather dark and all. Inspiration struck Ukta. Like a playground kid fighting the system, he would conceal a stone inside his snowball, but instead of smashing windows, he would aim for Kraktor. If it found its mark, the stone would leave a cut or bruise and Ukta would see his achievement. Grinning as he did so, he stuck his hand into a nearby asteroid field. As he searched for a small stone, it's all relative, his deviousness consumed him. All star giants are devious by nature. It's just that most lack the necessary cognitive capacity to formulate thoughts to actually do devious things. And in the unrelenting absolute zero temperatures of the extremities of the universe, movement is inhibited and extends to include neuron signalling. Ukta's fingers curled around the space rock the size of his fist. He dutifully patted a thin layer of snow over it and pulled his arm back. Before he had time to release the stone though, a sneeze convulsed deep inside him. He raised his hand to cover his gob, as his mammy had taught him, and in the process smattered snot across the asteroid. Ukta cursed and mumbled something about the cold and always getting sick. The star giant wiped his nose on his arm and squinted at the universe. There was a patch of constellation-free blackness, and he figured that's where Kraktor must have been lurking. With a tongue sticking out the side of his mouth, he took aim and released the permafrost projectile. Light years away, Kraktor stood open-mouthed. Like Ukta, he had come to the realization that there was no way of telling if his snowballs were hitting his opponent. However, being one of the more cerebrally challenged star giants, Kraktor was having a bit of difficulty figuring out what to do with this insight. Like Ukta, something struck. And like Ukta, it was Ukta's inspiration that struck Kraktor. Unfortunately for Kraktor, it was in a more developed and physical state at this point. Kraktor clutched his head and winced. He could feel liquid trickling through his fingers, and dabbed them to his tongue. He spat blood. His blood. Anger grew inside him, and he marched off into the darkness in search of his quarrelsome friend. Time passed. A lot of time. Empires rose and fell, species burst into existence only to be squashed by larger life forms who didn't take to upstarts. Planets were born and found themselves a sun before it unexpectedly exploded, for which it was deeply apologetic and insisted it was the first time that had happened. A canyon-sized gash ran across Cractor's forehead to his temple. Thick, gooey blood ran down the side of his face. Ukta poked the wound and giggled. Blood fell away from Cractor's face and drifted out into the universe. Cractor wrestled himself free, and Ukta held up his hands innocently. Cractor pushed him and was pushed right back, twice as hard. Cractor grimaced before he gave Ukta a galactic shove, and thus the fight began. There could now be an extensive description of their epic brawl, which took a tediously long time to reach a conclusion, eventually ending with Cractor's decapitation, but it's really not a very interesting story. On the other hand, back on the rock that instigated the whole affair, things were far more intriguing. Sometime before Cractor actually reached Ukta, the rock fell into the pool of the sun, and its icy shell melted to form great oceans. The rock settled itself into a steady orbit and set about attracting its own satellites. The cold virus from Ukta scurried across the rock in search of Cractor's blood, which had never come into contact with a virus and initially had no means to repel it. The aggressive virus wreaked havoc on the red cells while the white grew to resist it. Since the initial adaptations to get themselves legs and teeth and other useful things, the Virons hadn't gone through much evolutionary advancement. They became specialised over the years, and although they could infect other hosts, they were most effective against Cractor's vulnerable blood, which had to go through radical innovations of its own to fight back. They too sprouted appendages, and during a destiny-changing division, a mutation arose and one red individual split into 4. Over centuries this developed, and a single individual could become mother to thousands. As for the other animals of the world, they started life in the form of bacteria, before beginning the endless and haphazard process of evolution. Under the watchful gaze of Mother Nature, her charges spread throughout the oceans to occupy every role in every ecosystem under the waves. For a number of years, she tried to convince fish that land was a good idea. She'd filled it with as many tasty plants as she could think of, and as of yet, there were no predators. It was a paradise, and she was quite pleased with it. All it needed was some occupants. Sure, there were the insects, but she had grown tired of their buzz and felt it was time something took them down a peg or two. Fish, she felt, could do just that. Yes, her peers told her that a fish out of water would be like... Well, as it turned out, there wasn't actually a suitable platitude for them to make an adequate comparison to what it would be like. She ignored their comments all the same, and continued to tempt the fish from their familiar waters. Eventually, she was able to encourage one of her subjects into developing a primitive set of lungs. The fish didn't know how it felt about this, but with a nervous quiver of its gills, it dutifully struggled onto the beach to give them a spin. It did indeed find some easily digestible plants, as well as some of the slower insects, which it could flop after and suck up. The lungs, being as poorly developed as they were, soon forced the fish back to water, but it had a wonderful time. More fish followed this trailblazer's example, and they developed and split to occupy different niches in a range of ecosystems, and the rest, as they say, is history.